Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Beauty History. I am your host, Allison Chase. Beauty History is where you and I take a deep dive into the life and legacy of someone important in the fashion or beauty world because I think it's fascinating finding out who they were and why they're still famous today. We've talked about people like Hubert de Givenchy, Coco Chanel, of course, Tiffany, all sorts of people. But today, I want to do a deep dive into the life and legacy of Vivienne Westwood. How did she become the Vivienne Westwood? Because to many, she's considered the godmother of punk fashion. She is considered to be one of the top architects in bringing the fashion of punk rock to the mainstream in the 1970s in London. But before we go any further, let's take a second to grab our iced coffee or a hot coffee. Let's take a sip and let's get started. Join me the first Friday of each month for a new episode where we take a deep dive into a new icon in the fashion or beauty world. Welcome to the first episode of 2023. Feel free to leave a comment with recommendations or suggestions or requests for topics because we are trying something a little bit different today. I did do my makeup beforehand instead of during the episode because I attempted something a little bit more risky and I needed the concentration. So go ahead and leave a recommendation or suggestion down below. And before we go any further, I want to thank each and every one of you for watching, for supporting, for liking, for commenting. It really warms my heart. And I hope that all of you had a wonderful holiday season. I hope it was restful and not too stressful. I hope you got some time to relax. And I do want to take a moment to give a special thank you to those of you who have used the thanks button. The thanks button is a type of tip jar if you want. A thank you for those of you who've used the thanks button. You have purchased so many coffees. They've been extremely useful at coffee shops when I've been doing my research. So a special thank you to Elena Polshakov, Donica Spencer, Lauren S., The Foxy Century, and Christina O'Connell. Some of you are repeat offenders, and I really appreciate that. You have kept me caffeinated. So let's go ahead and dive into Vivienne Westwood. How did she become Vivienne Westwood? And also I want to take a special moment to look at some of her more noteworthy, iconic fashion moments, not only on the runway, but also in her personal life. Dame Vivienne Westwood was born Vivienne Isabel Swire. She was born April 8th, 1941 in Cheshire, England. She was born to a very modest working class family, nothing fancy. Her father was a shoemaker. Her mother worked at a cotton mill. So think like industrial factory workers, like very, very working class. And she was also the oldest child of three. And her early life wasn't really noteworthy. She was born just before the outbreak of the Second World War, like in England. But her life, like early life, was very mundane, very average. She grew up in the countryside, hopefully a very nice, normal childhood. But then in the 50s, her parents moved the family from the countryside to London. And they moved to a northwest suburb called Harlow. And this move that her parents made basically changed the outcome of Vivienne's life. It's interesting the choices that you make, but also the choices that the people around you make, the impact that it can have on you. Because when she moved to London, she just got exposed to so many different things, different cultures, different people, different languages, just different everything, which she never would have experienced out in the countryside. She had an interest in fashion and art and things like that from a very early age, but it was only because they moved to London that she got the opportunity to actually pursue this. And so at the age of 17, she actually left her family home and attended the Harlow School of Art, which is now known as the University of Westminster. Here, she studied fashion. This was always something that piqued her interest, fashion, art, all those things. So she actually was able to pursue this. However, it's interesting to note that Vivienne did have this sort of push and pull internally where she could sense that she wanted to gravitate towards something, but she had a hard time committing to it completely at first, which is understandable because sometimes the biggest leaps in life are the scariest. And she wanted to continue pursuing art and fashion and that entire world, but this was like post Second World War England, and she came from a working class family. Not exactly super thriving, didn't have a lot of excess income, and so the practical part of her brain that was like, oh, you should follow the formula of like, do this, this, and this. So she had a little bit of that struggle. She convinced herself essentially that she would not be able to make a lucrative career out of art and fashion, and that she needed to do something more pragmatic, more practical, and just more realistic in a way. She was scared to pursue her dreams. Let's say it. She was scared, which is very relatable and very understandable. And she left art school, unfortunately, after only one term. And I have a quote from her that says, I didn't know how a working class girl like me could possibly make a living in the art world. Listen, understandable. Not everyone has a safety network of rich parents or a rich partner who can just support you until your passion becomes lucrative. Very, very understandable. So she put her art dreams aside and the fashion world aside, and she went to study to become a teacher, to, have a job as a teacher at an elementary school. And that's what she did. She became a teacher. And that is the end of the story. The end. Just kidding. She did become a teacher. She did have an education program, but she did this for a little bit. She actually became a primary school teacher, and she did this for several years. She must have been a very fun and funky primary school teacher. Can you imagine? Because she was so creative, she must have had like the most fun activities and projects to do. So she actually lived like a normal life, like she did a formal education. She became a teacher. She worked at a primary school for several years, and she actually at the same time continued designing jewelry because like this like little itch inside of her to just like do something creative and artsy and fashion was always there. So she would create and design jewelry, and she would go sell them on the weekends at Portobello Market. Now, Portobello Road, it's this world famous street market in London, and if I ever go to London, I'm going to Portobello Road, and it's extremely diverse. It dates back to the 19th century. There's jewelry, clothing, food, drink, like it's like a big market. It's huge, and so a lot of people go there. And so she would go there on the weekends with her jewelry that she had designed when she wasn't grading papers, or not really papers, I guess, grading homework and doing parent-teacher conferences. And she followed the formula, get a proper job, get a proper husband. She actually got married in 1962 to Derek Westwood, which is where we get the name. They had a relationship for 3 years. He was an apprentice for Hoover, the vacuum company, so very working class, normal, quote unquote, and she actually designed her own wedding gown because, again, that itch was always there. She couldn't get rid of it, and they had a son, Benjamin Westwood. However, the couple they got married in 1962 and divorced in 1966 because Vivienne met someone by the name of Malcolm McLaren, and he was or is an English visual artist. He's a musician, he's a designer, he's like an artist, free spirit in a way. Like he's sort of the type of person who every aspect of fashion or art he touches becomes a creative explosion. And so they met and they fell in love. Yes, she fell in love with someone else. She met him in 1965. He was a student living in London, and she divorced Derek the year after they met. But she kept the name Westwood, clearly, Vivienne Westwood, and she went on to marry Malcolm in, I think, 66 or something. She went divorced and remarried quite soon after, and she had a son with Malcolm. His name is Joseph. And in the last few years of the 60s, leaking into the 70s, this is when Malcolm and Vivienne sort of started to collaborate together with their artistic visions and fashion, and she continued teaching. However, in 1971, that is when she quit teaching and actually officially went into the world of fashion and art as a career. Fingers crossed. Both Vivienne and Malcolm were activists at heart, and they saw fashion as an expression, as anti-government, and they really just saw fashion not only as a separate world, but just connected into everything, into politics, into music, into life, into everything. They just saw it as a connection to everything. And both of them were really not that interested in like the hippie movement of the 1960s, because in the 60s, London had this huge hippie free love movement, and the fashion was very influenced by the hippie movement. And it was not for Vivienne. She wasn't really into like the whole hippie dippy movement and the hippie aesthetic, I think specifically is what I'm trying to say here. She really wasn't into the flower child aesthetic. Because they were not huge fans of a lot of the clothing aesthetic on the market, they decided, let's just design and create our own clothing. And so they did. So together, the couple opened this small, dimly lit boutique in London at 430 King's Road. And the boutique went under so many different names. I'm honestly surprised with how successful Vivienne would go on to be, spoiler, because she changed the name of the boutique so many times. Like, it's really impressive, because typically with marketing, you want to like have a vision, a clear-cut logo or name or whatever. But they both changed the name of this boutique so many times. So one of the names was Let It Rock, because it was all about the new emerging punk rock scene. And so they changed it to Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, which doesn't really roll off the tongue. You know, when they say, where are you going? I'm going to Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die. All right. But eventually they landed on a name that really stuck and that really symbolized and was just a really good name for the brand and the boutique. It was called Sex. Yes, Sex, the boutique. So this was a meeting ground for a lot of like punk rock enthusiasts, people who were into punk rock music, who were into the punk rock aesthetic, the scene, which was really different. Definitely not my aesthetic, but I can appreciate that it's for someone else. They specialized in vintage 1950s aesthetics, but with a punk twist. So they would have t-shirts with pornographic photos on it, or graphic, not slurs, no, but swear words, or something that was like obscene and shocking. That's what they were looking for. That was the punk movement, something that was like ripped here with like safety pins holding it together, and then you would have like a middle finger up here, you know what I mean? Like just something that would be very shocking to a lot of British sensibilities. Vivienne made and designed a lot of the pieces, and this is where she really found herself as an artist. This is what everything had led to. This was the moment. She really became a punk icon, not only in her own aesthetic, because she was deeply involved and in love with the punk aesthetic, the punk movement. She was punk, and she made clothing for the punk world. And that's how she became one of the pioneers and architects in making punk part of pop culture, not just this niche little thing in London, but like making it explode worldwide. And this is where she transformed into the Vivienne Westwood. And so at the beginning of her journey, you know, the boutique was very small. It was very targeted towards like a very niche crowd that would come talk about music and government and politics and all of that together. And she would design these outfits that had lots of leather. They were very sexy. They were very vulgar. They were a little bit gross. They had like sadomasochist influences, but this was just all part of it. And it definitely made a lot of conservative British people blush, but that was sort of the point. And the collections were extremely popular. She would sell out. You know, you might think like, who would want to wear that? A lot of people did. A lot of people wanted to wear that, and she would sell out of stock immediately. So she was extremely successful because she was creating clothing that she wanted to wear because she was a punk. She wanted, like, if she thought of herself at a punk show, like a punk rock show, what would she want to wear to that show? And she would just make that, and then people who were the same mindset would come in and buy those items. She wanted to shock, she wanted to irritate, she wanted to provoke, and she did all of that. So she did really great. And what's interesting is the boutique actually came under fire because they were selling t-shirts with pornographic images on them. But it sort of just like added fuel to the fire. It just made them more punk by getting in trouble. They were charged with some obscenities laws, and it just helped them in a way. You know, it just made them more rebellious, more punk, more counterculture. It just made them more of that, which just helped them grow. And the name Vivienne Westwood grew like wildfire in England, in the punk scene, especially in the music scene, because punk was related to the punk rock music scene. So the fashion and the music, just like, it was one and the same. And so her name just spread out everywhere. And her partner at the time, Malcolm, was also a music manager for a little band called the Sex Pistols. And so when you think of punk rock, you probably think of Sid Vicious and the Sex Pistols. Well, they were wearing Vivienne Westwood. Vivienne Westwood dressed them. The Sex Pistols came to boutique Sex to go shopping because that was what they wanted to wear, and Vivienne would dress them. And you know, there was sort of this like this symbiotic relationship where the influence was flowing both directions. And so the Sex Pistols were dressed by Vivienne Westwood. Vivienne Westwood was inspired by the Sex Pistols. It was all just like one big happy punk rock family. And so that's when in 1975 they were fined for indecent exhibition, which was an obscenities law from 1959 that allowed the police to seize any material they deemed to be explicit. And so they got a slap on the wrist for that. But at that point, like, they were punk, and they were, you know, known for the Sex Pistols. So it just helped them. It helped legitimize them into being punk rock icons. And in 1977, Vivienne came out with a t-shirt. This is the God Save the Queen t-shirt. This is a white, off-the-shoulder, tattered, slightly destroyed t-shirt with a photo of the late monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, and her mouth, I think, is like ripped open, but then there's like a safety pin closing it together. This actually comes from a lyric from a song from the Sex Pistols called God Save the Queen, which is very anti-monarch, anti-establishment. And this came out the same year as the late monarch's Jubilee. So yeah, that's that. Now in 1981 is when Vivienne organized her very first fashion show, because up until then she was just designing for her boutique, but 81 is when she did the big catwalk, the show, the lights, the models. And the very first show was called Pirates. And I just think this looks so fantastical. To me, every single one of these models look like they came from a theatrical production of a pirate show. Like, everything is so theatrical, everything is so over the top, and for some reason, to me, this does have a touch of romance to it. It's much softer than her punk rock scene, and there's something about the billowiness of the fabric and the theatricality that to me is a touch romantic, and I really enjoy it. I think it's very, very nice. It's very creative. It's very wild. And what's interesting is this fashion show, Pirates, took place 6 months before the wedding of Lady Diana Spencer and now King Charles. Just interesting how different fashion can be on opposite ends of the spectrum. In 1983, Malcolm and Vivienne broke up, and she renamed the boutique to World's End. The boutique would be renamed several more times. I've honestly lost track, but I think World's End was symbolic perhaps to her feeling and her mood of her marriage, or her second marriage ending. But Vivienne kept reinventing herself. This was not the end of Vivienne. This was just, like a little detour, a little blip. And she drew inspiration from a lot of things. In the 80s, This was the Pirates era. It's a romantic era as well, but she took inspiration from the author Philip K. Dick and his novel Blade Runner. And she came out with a collection called Punkature, like punk nature, Punkature. And so she had a collection like that. The 1980s is considered to be Vivienne's romantic era. And you can definitely see a lot of the 1980s silhouette in the giant shoulders, the giant shoulder pads, things like that. So you can see this affected in her work. She also started taking a lot of cues from history in the 1980s. And so the spring-summer 1985 collection, she came out with the mini crinny, like crinoline, you know, the big puffy crinoline. Well, she made it mini and it almost looks like a ballerina tutu. Again, to me, it looks very romantic, very soft. And it was sort of exploring the differences with like the 1980s more masculine shoulder pads and making them harsh and, you know, a little bit more masculine. She wanted to do counterculture and do mini crinnies and sort of draw inspiration from the 17th century and do corsets and pay more attention to curves, and she always wanted to be counterculture. In 1992, Vivienne received an OBE. This is Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. These are awarded by the monarch, so it was Queen Elizabeth II, and she received this for her service to fashion. Now, I can only show you certain photos of this, or maybe certain photos with emojis, because I'm not trying to get canceled here. But basically, she showed up to Buckingham Palace in, you know, a gorgeous attire, and she took a spin. She took her long skirt, took a spin like this. Turns out, she was not wearing underwear. She was wearing sheer tights and no underwear. So yeah, I'm not trying to get canceled here or deleted off the internet. But yeah, she did that. She didn't do it in front of the Queen herself. She did it in front of all of the photographers. It's a move. Some people complained and said that she should have her title removed. Apparently, allegedly, the Queen thought it was amusing. You know, I'm sure the Queen saw a lot of things in her life, but she probably never saw anyone flash the photographers before receiving an OBE. The 90s is also where Vivienne solidified herself. The 90s was part of the rise of the supermodels, and a lot of famous runway shows are Vivienne Westwood. I know personally when I think of the 90s and supermodels, I do think of Karl Lagerfeld, but he was not alone in the 90s. We also had Vivienne Westwood. She had collections, Anglomania, which had lots of tartans and just looked so British. And she was very proud of her British heritage. And she put a lot of that in her fashion shows. Even though she had a lot to say about the monarchy and government, she was still proud of who she was. And I just think that her Anglomania collections are very beautiful. They're just very timeless in a way. I know that it's a lot, it's very extra, but I think the plaid and the tartans are very, very beautiful. And she actually invented her own clan and a plaid called the McAndreas. She was inspired by history again and Scottish tartans and clans, and each clan would have their own tartan. And at the time, she met and married her third husband, Andreas Crownthaler. And so the McAndreas tartan is named after him for their relationship. And they married in 1993, or met in 1993, and remained together until her death recently. Let's take a moment to appreciate some of the fashion shows from the 90s. So this is the Fall-Winter 1993. And here we have the goddess come to life, Naomi Campbell, very young, very beautiful. What a beauty. Now, this is very famous in fashion history because she fell. She took a tumble. Haven't we all? A few things to say. Some people said that she fell because of her heels, the big platforms. No. So if you are not aware, the tights that she's wearing, the leggings, they're made of rubber. And when she was walking, she sort of crossed her legs and the rubber caught. I don't know if you've ever worn rubber gloves. They don't really slip. They sort of catch. And so that threw her off balance and she ended up falling. Honestly, she looks like she fell with so much grace and poise. She really took this moment and was like, nobody's perfect. It happens. And you know what? If ever you have a little flub in life, guess what? Even Naomi Campbell fell on the runway, so it's fine. Don't be hard on yourself. And so I wanted to take a moment because this is quite quite iconic in fashion history. And we also have this moment here of Kate Moss. This was for the 1995 spring summer show, and this was very romantic and historical, and she had Marie Antoinette style makeup and this mini micro skirt, and she was topless, and she walked out eating an ice cream. I think it was a Magnum ice cream. Those are really good. And that was all she did. Like, Vivienne was like, here you go, have an ice cream, come back. And that's what she did. I mean, that's a pretty good way to get paid for a day's work. A lot of her ready to wear from the mid 90s, I think, looks really nice. I love a plaid skirt. I love a mini plaid skirt. So I think, honestly, a lot of this you could wear today. Maybe not some of the topless corsets. Maybe you would, I don't know you. But I think the plaid skirts and a lot of the plaid and tartan could be worn today very easily. And we have this photo here of Carla Bruni, the former First Lady of France. She was or is a supermodel. And so here we have this beautiful photo of like a beautiful woman wearing this luxurious real fur coat, and then she opens it and she's wearing a real fur merkin. Why not? Like, who comes up with this sort of thing? Art kids, that's who. I just think that's so ridiculous and so absurd and so silly and so fun at the same time. I just think it's quite something. You can see Carla's face. She's just like, yeah, it is what it is. Since the 2000s, Vivienne was really into climate change advocacy, climate change protests, and really was just an environmentalist in many ways. And she worked with Greenpeace on the Save the Arctic campaign. She designed graphic t-shirts that had all the profits go towards Greenpeace that said, climate change is my priority, not fashion. She was involved in different protests regarding climate change. And in 2014 or 2015 in London, Vivienne showed up at the then Prime Minister David Cameron's office dressed as a tank for a protest regarding the Shell gas extraction held in London. She also got involved with protests regarding Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, and she was an advocate for him and held many protests on his behalf. She did this not only on her own private time, but also for work during her fashion shows. During one of the fashion weeks, the London Fashion Week in 2012 or 2013, she had people walk out and also attendees wearing t-shirts saying, I am Julian Assange. And one thing interesting as well I have to mention about Vivienne Westwood and pop culture is, do you remember that little show, Sex and the City? Probably. Remember the movie, Sex and the City? When Carrie Bradshaw married or attempted to marry what's-his-face? Yeah, that dress. Remember that big billowing dress and that feather, that like peacock bluish green headpiece with the feather? That's Vivienne Westwood. So you can see sort of that romantic corset, billowing, pirate, historical 17th century vibe to that dress. And the big feather headpiece, I mean, it's all a little bit punk, it's a little bit edgy, it has a little bit of sharpness to it. And so a lot of people had a lot of comments to say on that dress. So leave a comment down below. What do you think of this whole ensemble? Vivienne also spent some time focusing on androgynous looks and sending models down the runway in completely androgynous looks, you know, mixing masculine and feminine and just sort of creating like a gender neutrality with certain shows that she had. And she was really known for being an activist, someone who cared about climate change and the catwalk, someone who really just did what she wanted and was firmly counterculture and anti-establishment, but somehow managed to be very successful at the same time. She was also an avid gardener and also a vegetarian. And sadly, a few weeks ago, actually, on December 29th, 2022, Vivienne passed away at the age of 81. And it's always sad when we have a loss of life, but for some reason, I'm not that sad this time because she just lived her life. Like, I think she had those moments where she was sort of pulled back to the pragmatic side, but that passion, that drive, that little spark, you know, that spark inside of you, she just followed it, and look at where it led her. And so it is sad for her family, of course, and her loved ones, but she's left such a great legacy. She's just so iconic and so interesting. And she really marched to the beat of her own drum. She didn't care about what the aesthetic of the day was. She did what she wanted. She dressed how she wanted. And it's just very refreshing. And you know, when I do these deep dives, I sometimes uncover unpleasant things, but you know what? She seems to have been a really lovely lady. I mean, maybe I didn't agree with all of her politics, but she seems to have been very well rounded and well balanced. I know she was married 3 times, but it seems like she was a serial monogamist. Like, I did research and she was married 3 times, but I don't think that there were many boyfriends in between. I think she was just like jumping from like one serious relationship to the next. And in a way, she just seems to have led like a wholesome life. I think maybe myself included, we judge people too harshly on just how they present themselves. And when someone is dressed with like a mohawk and like safety pins, you might be like, oof, you know, what are they like? But she seems to have been a really nice lady who just enjoyed sparking controversy and making people talk. And you know what? Who cares? Because sometimes when I do research on certain people who seem to be all shiny and nice, turn out not to be so nice. I know when I think my first episode was on Yves Saint Laurent, YSL, the founder. He was always dressed in the nicest, most polished suits. The last several years of his life, I think a lot of the years of his life were not sober in any way, shape, or form. So you really never know. You never know. You can't judge a book by its cover. And that is Vivienne Westwood, the rebel, the punk icon, the activist, the funky lady, funky, edgy, did what she wanted. Good for you, Vivienne. So yeah, that is Vivienne Westwood. And like I said, I have a new episode the first Friday of every month. I hope you take the time to leave a comment, and subscribe. All of those things engage with the channel, and that will just push my video out to more people. So if you want to support me, go ahead and do all of those things. And on that note, I think that's all I have for you guys for today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Hope you have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.